A stranger's cry. James's footsteps slowed as he walked deeper into the park, his eyes lost in the beauty of the surroundings, but his mind far from the present. He had always found solace in nature, but lately, it felt more like a quiet reminder of everything he had lost. The trees were bare, their limbs reaching upward like desperate hands begging for something that might never come. The wind rustled through the branches, and the leaves danced across the cold, hard ground. Despite the chill in the air, James barely noticed the cold, lost in his own reverie. The park was a place of memories for him, not only because of the years he had spent walking there with his wife, but also because it was where he had found Daniel, the boy he now considered his son. It had been years ago, a time when grief had swallowed him whole. He had been a different man back then, barely holding on to any sense of purpose after losing the love of his life. It was on this very path that he had stumbled upon a small, trembling figure in the bushes, a boy no older than 6, abandoned in the cold, with no one in sight to claim him. At the time, the boy had looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, his face streaked with dirt and his clothes in tatters, much like the boy now sitting beside him. James had taken the boy in without a second thought, but even now, years later, he still couldn't explain why he had. It wasn't the first time he'd seen a child abandoned, but there was something about this boy that had tugged at his heartstrings, something in the way the boy had looked at him, a silent plea for help that James couldn't ignore. The years since had been filled with quiet moments of joy and pain, laughter and sorrow, as James raised Daniel as his own. Daniel had grown into a young man with a heart full of gratitude and an uncanny ability to find the good in others. Despite the tough start he had in life, Daniel was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and James couldn't have been prouder of him. But now, as James walked through the park once again, that same feeling from all those years ago, of being called to care for a child in need, had returned. The faint whimper grew louder, and James's attention snapped back to the present. His heartbeat quickened as he followed the sound, the path growing less clear as the bushes grew thicker. He pushed through them, his hands brushing against the rough branches, and his breath quickening with each step. He had no idea what he would find, but something in the pit of his stomach told him that this wasn't just any ordinary child. There, at the edge of a small clearing, he found the source of the cry. A boy, no older than 6, with dirt-smeared cheeks and ragged clothing, much like the child James had once found, sat huddled against the trunk of a tree, shaking. His wide, frightened eyes met James's gaze, and for a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. James's heart thudded in his chest, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the boy. He had seen this look before, this terror that made the child's eyes as wide as saucers, the kind of look that only came from those who had experienced something deeply traumatic. The boy didn't speak at first. He only trembled, his small body shivering against the chill of the night air. James crouched down in front of him, lowering his voice to a soothing tone. "Hey there," James said gently, his hand shaking as he reached toward the boy. "It's okay. You're safe now. What's your name?" The boy swallowed, his lips trembling as he looked up at James. "Daniel," he whispered, the name barely audible. James blinked in surprise, his heart racing. The boy's name was Daniel, just like the son he had raised all these years. The coincidence was too much for him to ignore. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Could it be? Could this child somehow be connected to him? The boy was no more than a stranger, and yet, the name he spoke, the look in his eyes, it all felt too familiar. "Daniel," James murmured, his voice barely audible, his mind racing. "I'm James. You're safe with me." The boy didn't seem to register much of what James had said, his small hands clutching at the edges of his ragged shirt as he looked around with wide, panicked eyes. It was as if he didn't quite understand where he was or what was happening. "I won't hurt you," James reassured him gently, trying to keep his voice calm. "Do you have anyone, Daniel? Family? Someone who can help you?" The boy shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes as he sniffled, too frightened to speak. James's heart went out to him. There was no way he could leave this child alone, not when he was clearly so lost and afraid. With a deep sigh, James stood, extending his hand to the boy. "Come on, Daniel. Let's get you somewhere warm. I'll help you. You don't have to be alone anymore." The boy hesitated, but after a long pause, placed his small hand into James's, and together they began walking back toward the park bench, where James had first spotted him. The walk back was slow, the boy clinging to James's side with an almost desperate need for security. It was clear that something had shaken him to his core, but James couldn't figure out what. The child hadn't said a word since revealing his name, and it troubled James. There was so much this boy wasn't saying, so much that was hidden beneath the surface of those wide, frightened eyes. James helped the boy onto the park bench, wrapping his coat around his shoulders, trying to shield him from the chill in the air. He had no idea what had led this boy to be abandoned in the park, nor why he had appeared in this very spot. But one thing was certain: James wasn't going to let him go through this alone. Just then, James's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the message from Daniel, the son he had raised. "Hey, Dad, are we still on for dinner tonight?" James's fingers hesitated over the phone for a moment. He didn't want to involve Daniel just yet. He didn't want to complicate things, but he knew he had to tell him something, at least. He quickly typed a reply. "Something's come up. I'll explain later. Stay home." Once the message was sent, he tucked the phone back into his pocket, turning his attention back to the boy. Something about the name Daniel, the way it lingered in the air, felt like more than a coincidence. The boy's presence here felt like a sign, a message from fate, or perhaps from the past. James glanced down at the boy, still huddled beneath his coat. "What happened to you, Daniel? Who left you here?" he asked softly, more to himself than to the child. But Daniel remained silent, his small shoulders shaking as he pressed further into the warmth of James's coat. And for the first time, James allowed himself to believe that this moment, this strange, unexpected meeting, might lead to answers he never saw coming. A hidden past. The drive home was a blur, the rhythmic hum of the engine, and the passing headlights of the few cars on the road providing a steady but almost hypnotic backdrop to James's thoughts. The boy, Daniel, sat quietly in the passenger seat, his small frame curled up in the corner, his hands folded in his lap as he stared out the window. His face, once streaked with dirt and grime, now seemed pale, his eyes wide and unblinking as he gazed into the passing night. James's mind was racing, the coincidence of the boy's name repeating in his thoughts. Daniel. The boy's name echoed through his brain, and with each repetition, James felt a deep unease stir in his chest. It was the same name as his adopted son, the son he had raised as his own. Could it be possible that the boy in his car was somehow connected to the child he had nurtured for all these years? The coincidence was too strange to ignore, but James couldn't bring himself to ask the boy directly. There was too much fear in the child's eyes, too much uncertainty. The boy hadn't said a word since he revealed his name, and James couldn't bring himself to press further. Not yet. As they neared home, James glanced over at the boy once more. Daniel's eyes were still wide, his face expressionless. He looked lost, as if the world he had known had been torn away from him, leaving only confusion and fear in its place. And yet, there was a quiet strength in him, something that James couldn't quite explain. It was the same strength he had seen in his own Daniel when he had first taken him in all those years ago. When they arrived at the house, James parked the car in the driveway and sat for a moment, just staring at the front door. His own house, once filled with the sounds of his late wife's laughter and the joy of family life, now seemed eerily silent. It felt like a place of mourning, a home haunted by memories. It had been 3 years since his wife had passed, and the emptiness still lingered in every corner of the house. And now, with this new boy sitting beside him, the house felt as if it might fill with life again, if only for a moment. James took a deep breath and turned to the boy. "Come on, Daniel," he said softly, opening the door and stepping out. The boy slowly followed, his footsteps hesitant but steady. Together, they walked up to the porch and entered the house. Inside, the silence was overwhelming. The smell of old wood and the faint traces of his wife's perfume still lingered in the air, despite the years that had passed. James led the boy into the living room and motioned for him to sit on the couch. "Make yourself comfortable. I'll get you something to eat," he said, trying to keep his voice light, though his thoughts were anything but. As he headed toward the kitchen, James's mind raced again. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a chance encounter. There was something about this boy, this Daniel, that tugged at his heart. Was it possible that the boy had some connection to his own son? Was there a hidden past that James was only beginning to scratch the surface of? James's hand trembled as he opened the refrigerator, his mind racing with possibilities. Could this boy be his biological son? Could he be the lost child of someone James had known long ago? Someone whose life had intersected with his in ways he couldn't yet understand. He took a deep breath, shaking off the confusion and settling on preparing a simple meal. The boy would need food, and James didn't have the answers yet. There would be time for questions later. Right now, he needed to take care of him. While James prepared the food, Daniel remained in the living room, staring into the distance. James glanced at him occasionally, wondering what was going on in the boy's mind. There was so much left unsaid, so much mystery hanging in the air. Finally, after a few minutes, James brought the food to the table and set it down in front of the boy. The boy's eyes flickered toward the plate, but he didn't move. He just sat there, unmoving, as though frozen in time. James sat down next to him, trying to offer comfort. "It's okay. You can eat," he said gently. "You're safe here." The boy's eyes met his, but there was still that same hesitation in his gaze. It was as though the boy didn't know whether he could trust James, didn't know if he was truly safe. It made James's heart ache, but he understood. Trust wasn't something that could be given lightly, especially after everything the boy had been through. James knew the feeling all too well. Slowly, Daniel reached out, his small hands trembling as he picked up the fork. He took a tentative bite, his eyes never leaving James's face as if searching for something. "Do you have anyone, Daniel?" James asked softly. "Family. Parents." Daniel paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, and then set it down with a sigh. He looked down at his hands, clasped tightly in his lap. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't remember." James's heart clenched. "It's okay. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," he said, though he could feel the weight of the boy's words pressing on him. "But you're not alone anymore. I'll take care of you." For the first time, the boy's eyes softened, a flicker of hope shining through the fear. "You'll take care of me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "I will. I promise." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes closing briefly, as though allowing himself to believe James's words. There was a long pause, the quiet of the room stretching out, before Daniel spoke again, his voice low but steady. "I remember. My name is Daniel. But I don't know who I am. I don't know where I came from. I don't know who my family is. All I remember is a letter. It was on my birthday." James's heart skipped a beat. A letter. The same letter. The boy's voice trembled as he spoke the words, but James didn't need to hear any more. He already understood. It wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. James stood up, his mind racing. A letter. What letter? His voice was urgent now, filled with a sense of impending revelation. Daniel looked up at him, his eyes wide with confusion. "I don't remember. Not everything. But I remember it had something. Something that changed everything." James took a deep breath, his mind spinning as the pieces of the puzzle began to shift into place. The boy's name, the letter, the strange connection between him and his son. There was something much bigger at play here, something that James couldn't yet understand. But that didn't matter right now. What mattered was that Daniel, this boy, was here, and he needed James. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing across the room. There were answers to find, and this letter, this mysterious piece of the puzzle, was the key. Without it, they would never know the truth. But he would find it. He would find out everything. James stopped pacing and turned to the boy. "Daniel, I promise you, we'll get to the bottom of this," he said firmly, his voice full of determination. "I'm going to help you find your family. We'll figure this out together." Daniel looked up at him, his face full of hope, but still shadowed by doubt. The road ahead would be long, but James was ready to walk it. For the boy, for his own son, and for the truth. The truth unraveled. The days that followed felt like a blur for James. The house, which had once seemed so quiet and lonely, now felt filled with life, though it was a life shrouded in mystery. Daniel, the boy he had taken in, had begun to open up in small ways. He still didn't speak much about his past, but James could see the small flickers of trust beginning to take root. He ate with them at the dinner table, helped around the house in his quiet way, and began to adjust to the steady rhythm of their life together. But there was something unspoken between them, an unvoiced question that hung in the air. The letter, the one Daniel had mentioned. It was clear that whatever it contained, it was important, and it was the only clue they had about his past. Without it, they were left in the dark. James had tried asking about the letter again, but Daniel had only given him vague, fragmented answers. "I don't remember much," he would say. "I just remember it was on my birthday, and something about my family, but it's all blurry." It was frustrating. Every time he tried to pry deeper, the boy would retreat into himself, pulling away, as if afraid of what he might remember. James knew that pushing him too hard would only drive him further away, so he had learned to tread lightly, offering comfort and safety without demanding answers. For now, that was all he could do. It wasn't until a week later that something changed. James was sitting at his desk in the study one evening, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath his feet. He had been going over some old papers, sorting through things that had accumulated over the years, when he heard a soft knock at the door. "Come in," James called, looking up from his desk. Daniel stepped into the room, his expression hesitant. He looked down at the floor for a moment before raising his eyes to meet James. There was something different in his gaze now, something that wasn't there before. It was as if the walls he had built around himself had started to crack, and in that moment, James knew that the boy was ready to share more. "I found something," Daniel said quietly, holding out a small, crumpled envelope. James's heart skipped a beat. The letter, the one he had been hoping to find. Without saying a word, James reached out and took the envelope. It was old, the edges worn and frayed, as if it had been handled many times before. There was no return address, no name written on the outside, just the single word Daniel scrawled across the front in messy handwriting. He carefully opened it, his hand shaking slightly as he unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was uneven, as if it had been written in haste, but the words were clear. "My dear Daniel," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means that you are no longer where you once were. I can only hope that the man who found you took care of you as I intended. This letter is both a confession and a plea. The truth of your origins is complicated, and I am afraid it will not be easy to hear. I am your father, but not in the way that most fathers are. Your birth was not one of love, but of necessity. You were meant to be something, someone, more than just a child. I hope that, one day, you will understand why." The letter went on, detailing the circumstances of Daniel's birth, circumstances James could never have imagined. Daniel wasn't the biological child of the man who had written the letter, but rather the product of a secret experiment, a child engineered for a purpose James couldn't fully comprehend. His biological father was a scientist, involved in a covert project that sought to create a new kind of human, one with enhanced intelligence and strength, someone who could push the boundaries of what humanity was capable of. James's head spun as he read the words, his mind struggling to process the shocking revelations. How could this be? How could Daniel, the boy he had raised as his own, be the product of such a twisted plan? And yet the letter was clear. There was no denying the truth of what it said. The letter continued. Your mother was a part of this experiment. Though you never knew her, she was one of many women chosen for her genetics, and you were the result of that union. But your mother was not prepared for the child she carried. She wanted to escape the life she had been forced into, and she made a choice to leave. She never returned to me or to the project. And I've been searching for you ever since. I've tried to protect you from the truth, Daniel, because I know it will change everything for you. But now you must make a decision. The life you've been living up until now has been a lie. I can't change what's already been done, but I can tell you this. You are not alone. There are others like you, and there is a place for you, if you want it. The letter ended abruptly, with no sign-off or signature, just a few words that seemed to trail off into nothing. James read it again, his eyes scanning the same words in disbelief. The boy he had raised, the child he had thought of as his own, was not his at all, not biologically, anyway. And the truth of who Daniel was, what he was far darker than James could have ever imagined. Daniel had been part of an experiment, one that sought to create a new kind of human, one designed for something greater, more powerful than any normal child. And yet Daniel had no idea. He had grown up believing he was just like any other child, raised by James as a father who loved him, and yet his true origins were hidden, buried beneath years of lies. James looked up at the boy, who stood in the doorway, watching him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The weight of the letter was heavy in James's hands, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, James stood, his voice low but steady. Daniel, I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever expected. But I need you to understand something. None of this changes what I feel for you. You are my son. I raised you, and nothing in that letter, nothing in your past, will change that. You are mine in every way that matters. Daniel's eyes filled with tears, and he took a hesitant step forward. But I'm not your son, he said quietly. Not really. I don't belong here. James reached out, pulling him into a tight embrace. Yes, you do, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. You belong here. With me. You're my son, Daniel, and you always will be. No matter what that letter says. For a long moment, the two of them stood there, holding each other in silence. James didn't know what the future held, what challenges they would face in the coming days, but one thing was certain. No matter what Daniel's origins were, James would stand by him. He would protect him, just as he had always done. The truth had been revealed, but it wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The path forward. The weeks that followed the revelation of Daniel's true origins were a time of upheaval. The once quiet house, where only the whispers of old memories had lived, now pulsed with questions, doubts, and, in some cases, a strange sense of freedom. James had expected the truth to change things between them, but he hadn't anticipated how deeply it would shake both him and Daniel. James had known for years that his life had been far from ordinary. His wife had died unexpectedly, leaving him with a heart full of sorrow and a home that felt hollow. He'd never anticipated being a father to someone else's child, let alone a child created for a purpose that had been far beyond his understanding. But despite the shock and confusion that clouded his thoughts, he had always felt a deep connection to Daniel. That bond didn't change, no matter the revelations of the past. But now, as the days wore on, that connection was tested in ways he could never have imagined. Daniel had become a ghost of the boy he had been. He would sit alone for hours, staring at the walls or out the window, his thoughts lost somewhere between the past and the uncertain future. The boy was filled with a quiet anger that James could feel, though Daniel hadn't voiced it. There were days when Daniel seemed withdrawn, as though he was grappling with a part of himself that he hadn't known existed. His identity, his entire sense of self, was in turmoil. Who was he, really? Was he the child James had raised, or was he just the result of a science experiment, a mere product of someone else's design? It wasn't that Daniel resented James, far from it. The love and trust that had been built over the years still held strong between them. But the weight of his own origins was something that Daniel couldn't escape. The questions gnawed at him. What did it mean to be human? If he wasn't truly human, if he was part of something else, did he still have a place in the world? One evening, as the sky outside darkened into shades of violet and gold, James found himself once again sitting at the dinner table with Daniel. The silence between them was thick, neither of them willing to break it. James had learned that sometimes, in moments of uncertainty, it was better to let the silence linger. Daniel needed time. Time to process, to understand, and to find his own way through the storm of emotions that he was no doubt experiencing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said, his eyes downcast. "I feel like I don't belong anywhere. I don't fit in with the world I thought I was part of, but I don't fit in with your world either. I'm not normal." James leaned forward, his heart heavy with sympathy. "Daniel, listen to me," he said, his voice firm. "There's no such thing as normal. People are all different, and we all have things about ourselves that we don't understand, or that we wish were different. But the one thing you can be sure of is this: you belong here. You belong with me. And that's what matters." Daniel looked up at him, his eyes searching James's face for any hint of doubt. But James's gaze was steady, full of the same warmth and love he had always shown him. "I don't know if I can believe that," Daniel whispered. "You're telling me that I'm your son, but I'm not. Not really. I'm just a—" His voice trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "You are my son, Daniel," James insisted, standing and walking around the table to stand beside him. "In every way that counts. You don't have to be anyone else. Just be you. You're the son I raised, and that's enough for me." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat constricting as emotion threatened to rise. It had been so hard to hear those words, to let himself believe them, especially when everything about his past was still so murky. He had been told that he was part of an experiment, created for some higher purpose that James couldn't even begin to understand. The boy didn't know who his real family was, or if he even had one. He was lost in a world that felt foreign to him. For a long moment, James stayed silent, unsure of how to ease the boy's fears. He had never been in Daniel's position, never had to grapple with an identity that wasn't his own. But James knew one thing for certain. Daniel wasn't going to find answers by retreating into himself. "I know it's a lot to take in," James said after a long pause. "And I know you're scared. But we can't live in the past forever. The truth is out there, and we'll find it. But that doesn't mean we have to let it define us." Daniel nodded, his fingers nervously tapping on the edge of his plate. "But how do we even begin to figure this out? What if I'm not? What if I'm not who I think I am? What if there's nothing for me out there?" James placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a gentle squeeze. "Then we'll figure it out together. We always have, haven't we? We'll start with finding out more about your biological father. There are answers there, Daniel. And when we find them, we'll know where we go from here." Daniel stared at the table for a long moment, deep in thought. The weight of what James had said was heavy, but the boy could feel the sincerity in his words. For the first time in weeks, something inside him began to stir, a faint spark of hope that hadn't been there before. "Do you really think there's a place for me?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. James nodded without hesitation. "I do. Because the one thing I know for sure is that you are not just the product of some experiment. You are Daniel, my son, and that means you have a place in this world, a place here with me." and together, we'll figure the rest out." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, and for the first time, Daniel allowed himself to believe them. He wasn't sure of everything that lay ahead. There were too many unknowns, too many pieces of the puzzle that remained scattered. But there was one thing he was certain of. For the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. The path forward wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be filled with questions, confusion, and challenges. But Daniel knew, deep in his heart, that whatever came next, James would be with him. They would face it together. In the days that followed, they began their search. James reached out to old contacts, investigating the whereabouts of Daniel's biological father and the experiment he had been part of. The search led them down a trail of secrecy, shadowy organizations, and hidden truths, but they pressed on, determined to uncover the answers that Daniel so desperately needed. As they journeyed deeper into the mystery, Daniel began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to reconcile the boy he had been with the person he was becoming. It was a long road ahead, but at least now, Daniel knew that he wasn't walking it alone. How is the continuation coming along? Would you like to adjust anything or keep the momentum going? The shadows of the past. The days turned into weeks, and James and Daniel found themselves in the midst of a labyrinthine search for answers. Every lead they followed seemed to reveal more questions, more dead ends, and more complexities than they could have ever anticipated. But despite the frustration, there was a quiet determination between them. The bond they shared, their shared history and love, kept them going, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. The more they dug into Daniel's past, the more they discovered that there was a web of secrecy surrounding his origins. It wasn't just the letter that had pointed them to the truth. There were traces, fragments, scattered in unexpected places, each piece a puzzle that slowly began to form a terrifying picture. James had reached out to a few of his old contacts, people he had known from his younger days as a journalist, back when he had written about scientific and technological advances. The connections were slim, and the leads were few, but it was all they had. Most of the people he spoke with gave vague answers or denied any knowledge of the experiment that had led to Daniel's birth. Others became downright evasive, offering cryptic warnings or threatening messages meant to dissuade them from digging deeper. One cold afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows across their quiet home, James received a phone call that changed everything. It was from someone who had once been part of the scientific community, someone who had known about the covert project that had created Daniel. The voice on the other end of the line was unfamiliar but heavy with gravity. "I know what you're looking for," the voice said, its tone low and urgent. "You don't want to dig too deep, James. There are things you don't know, things that will put you both in danger." James's pulse quickened as he leaned forward, gripping the phone tighter. "Who is this? What are you talking about?" "I can't tell you everything, but I can give you a name," the voice continued. "If you want to know more about your son's past, you'll need to find Dr. Elena Stokes. She's the key to everything." The line went dead before James could ask anything more, leaving him with a whirlwind of questions. Who was Dr. Elena Stokes? Why was she so important? And why had this person, whoever they were, warned him away from the truth? That night, as the wind howled outside and the house seemed unusually quiet, James couldn't shake the unease that settled deep in his chest. The search was taking a dangerous turn, and Daniel, though strong, had no idea what he was about to face. The following morning, Daniel was in the kitchen, his back to the counter as he stared out the window, lost in thought. James watched him for a moment, his heart aching for the boy he had come to love like his own. He had never wanted this life for Daniel. This search for truth, for answers that might shatter everything they had built together. But the letter, the revelations, had set them on a path they couldn't turn away from. "Daniel," James said softly, stepping into the room. "I've been given a name. Someone who might know more about your past." Daniel turned to face him, his brow furrowed in confusion. A name. Who? Dr. Elena Stokes, James replied, the name still tasting strange on his tongue. She's connected to the project, the one that created you, and if we want answers, we'll need to find her. Daniel looked away for a moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I don't know if I'm ready to hear all of this, James. I don't think I can take it. James crossed the room to stand beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. You don't have to do this alone. You never have, and you never will. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling the weight of James's words settle on his shoulders. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about them, together, facing whatever came next. I'm scared, Daniel whispered. What if it's worse than I think? What if I'm not human at all? James's voice was steady and comforting. You are human, Daniel, more than anyone else I know. And I'm here with you, every step of the way. We'll face this together. It was a promise, and Daniel clung to it, as if it was the last anchor keeping him from being lost in the storm of his own identity. The search for Dr. Elena Stokes took them far from their small town and into the heart of a larger, more unfamiliar world. They traveled across states, following vague leads and tracking down old research papers, trying to piece together the elusive doctor's whereabouts. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. The air seemed thick with shadows, and every new encounter was laden with the threat of being watched, of someone following their every move. It wasn't until they reached a secluded cabin in the mountains that they finally found something. Someone that could help them. A former colleague of Dr. Stokes, now living in hiding, had agreed to meet them. James had no idea how the meeting would go, but they had little choice. It was their best shot at learning the truth. The cabin was old, surrounded by tall pines that cast long shadows across the dirt road leading up to it. They parked their car at the edge of the clearing, the sound of the engine shutting off ringing in the air. James's heart raced, but he knew they couldn't turn back now. The truth was within their reach. As they approached the door, it creaked open, revealing a man in his late 50s, his face lined with years of worry and regret. His eyes flickered over them, but there was a wariness in his gaze, as if he was unsure of whether he could trust them. You're looking for Dr. Stokes, he said, his voice rough. I've heard about you. I know what she did. But be warned, she's not the person you think she is, and neither is your son. Daniel flinched at the words, his stomach twisting. The man noticed and softened slightly. You deserve the truth, he said quietly, but it's not going to be easy. James stepped forward, his voice firm. We'll take whatever it takes to find her. We're not afraid of the truth. The man studied them for a long moment before stepping aside, gesturing for them to enter. Come inside. I'll tell you what I know, but you're not going to like it. The door closed behind them with a soft thud, and as they stepped into the dimly lit cabin, a sense of foreboding settled over them. They were about to uncover the final pieces of a puzzle that had already begun to tear their world apart. The unraveling. The air inside the cabin was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. It was a place that seemed stuck in time, frozen in a moment long past. The man, who had introduced himself only as Daniel's source, motioned for them to sit at a small wooden table near the fireplace. His hand shook slightly as he closed the door behind them, and the shadows in the cabin seemed to grow darker, stretching across the walls. As they sat, Daniel's heart beat louder in his chest, the tension thick between him and James. They had come all this way to get answers, to unravel the truth that had haunted Daniel for so long. But now that they were here, an overwhelming sense of dread settled in his stomach. He had always known that the truth wouldn't be simple or easy, but this felt like it might be more than he could bear. The man sat across from them, his eyes lingering on Daniel, studying him in a way that made the boy uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy as though he hadn't spoken in years. I was part of the team that worked on the project, he said, his gaze flickering between James and Daniel. The one that created you, Daniel. Dr. Stokes, she was the lead. But she's not who you think she is. And neither are you. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. He had always known that his origins were shrouded in mystery, but hearing someone so directly confirm it was a different kind of pain. It was as if every piece of his life had just been pulled out from under him. You were part of the project?" James asked, his voice low with disbelief. He had known that things weren't straightforward, but hearing it out loud felt like confirmation of all the worst fears he had buried deep inside. The man nodded, his face grim. "Yes, I didn't know much at first. I wasn't one of the top researchers, but I was there. Dr. Stokes was obsessed with creating something different, something beyond human. Your son, Daniel, was part of an experiment. You weren't supposed to be a child. You were supposed to be something else, something designed, controlled." Daniel leaned forward, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. "What do you mean by that? What was I supposed to be?" The man hesitated, and for a moment, it felt as though the very air in the room had gone still. "You were supposed to be a new kind of being, part human, part something else, a hybrid. The project was meant to create a race of people who could survive in environments where no human could. Stronger, faster, more resilient. You were an experiment in genetic engineering. But something went wrong. Something went wrong." Daniel repeated, his voice tight with anger. "What do you mean by that?" The man's eyes darkened, and he lowered his voice as if afraid someone might overhear. "You were supposed to be a tool, a weapon. But Dr. Stokes, she couldn't bring herself to see you that way. After she saw you grow, after you were born, she began to care for you. She raised you as her own project, trying to mold you into the very thing she had planned. But she couldn't. You were human, Daniel, more human than she could ever have predicted. She couldn't control you the way she wanted." James felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he heard the words. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was more horrifying than anything he had imagined. Daniel wasn't just the boy he had raised. He was something entirely different, something created for a purpose that had nothing to do with love or family. "That's why they abandoned you," the man continued, his voice growing more subdued. "Once they realized they couldn't control you, they decided to let you go. They erased your history, your records. They wiped you clean. You were a lost experiment, discarded like nothing more than an afterthought." Daniel sat back, stunned into silence. His whole life, everything he had known and believed, suddenly felt like it was built on sand. The walls of his identity began to crumble around him, and for the first time, he felt the crushing weight of everything he had been denied. The truth of his origins, the truth of his purpose. Was he just an accident? A mistake? "Is that why you kept me?" Daniel's voice cracked, the words barely audible. "Is that why you took me in, James? Because you thought I was a lost child, or because you knew who I really was?" James's face was pale, and his jaw clenched as he looked at the boy he had raised, the boy he had loved as his own. He wanted to reach out, to say something to comfort him, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was shake his head slowly, his heart aching with the realization that nothing had been as simple as he thought. "No," James said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I never knew. I only knew you needed someone. I only knew you were a child who needed a home. And I gave you that. I raised you because you were mine in every way that mattered. I didn't care about your origins, about where you came from. I cared about who you were." Daniel looked down at the table, his fingers tightening around the edge, nails digging into the wood. A strange, hollow feeling spread through him as the weight of James's words sunk in. James had loved him. Truly, completely. But now, there was this unbearable truth, this knowledge that Daniel was not what he thought he was. The man across from them watched silently, waiting for them to absorb the gravity of what he had just said. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke again, his voice steady but filled with a tinge of regret. "There's more," he said. "If you want to know the full truth, you'll have to go to her. Dr. Stokes. She's the only one who can answer the questions you have. But I warn you, it won't be easy. She's dangerous. And she's been hiding from the authorities for years. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Where do we find her? The man looked at him gravely, then slowly wrote down an address on a piece of scrap paper. She's been living in hiding, but this address should lead you to her. If she's still alive, you'll find her there. James reached out, taking the paper from the man's hand. As he studied it, the reality of their situation began to settle in. They were on the edge of something huge, something that could change everything. "Thank you," James said quietly, his eyes flickering with uncertainty but determination. "You've given us a way forward. We'll go to her. We need to know the truth." The man nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "Be careful. The truth you're looking for may not be what you expect. And once you know it, there may be no turning back." With those final words, he stood and turned away, leaving James and Daniel to process everything that had been revealed to them. As the door creaked open and closed behind them, the weight of the decision ahead hung in the air like a heavy fog. They were about to meet Dr. Stokes, the woman who held the final key to the mystery of Daniel's past. But in their hearts, they both knew that once they uncovered the truth, their lives would never be the same.